Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 Small Farm Winter Webinar Series hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farm team. This is Zach Grant here, Local Foods and Small Farms educator in Cook County and your webinar coordinator and primary moderator. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we're going to do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. This is a tight time frame for our educators to deliver information. So please limit your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I'll do my best to make sure our presenters answer them at the end. This presentation is being recorded, and I will email a link to the archive presentation as soon as possible after this concludes. There will be a short link for an online evaluation included with the email, and we'd very much appreciate your feedback. New this year, we will also start sharing a screenshot of a QR code that you can scan with your phone, with your camera phone or your QR reader, and that will link you directly to the webinar. And that will be the last slide of the presentation. We're using Zoom's webinar platform this year, so there's a few other additional features to note. At the bottom, there's a poll option, and in that poll option, you're going to find a voluntary and anonymous demographic form that helps us very much in Extension. There's also a Q&A section and a chat box. So in the Q&A section, you can put your questions for the presenter that we'll ask at the end. And the chat box for any other questions, technical questions related to the webinar itself. So this week's presentation is from Dr. Josie Rodolfi. Dr. Rodolfi is one of our newest members of the College of ACES. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Ag and Biological Engineering. Her undergrad and grad work focused on ag communications and education, respectively, at Iowa State. She focused on occupational and environmental health for her PhD work at the University of Iowa. Her research interests include child agricultural injury prevention, young adult agricultural workers, mental health, and ag safety and health. We are very excited to have her in our college and look forward to her future work. When I learned of her appointment, I knew I had to get her on this webinar series. The space surrounding stress and its impacts on agriculture are very far-reaching. So I asked Dr. Rodolfi if she would share a little bit with us today about farm stress and its impact on mental health. With that, I will let her take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. As Zach said, I am originally from Iowa. I joined the University of Illinois about 6 months ago. And for the last couple of years, my research has really focused on the mental health and stress experience of our farmers. So we're going to talk a lot today. I hope to answer everybody's questions. There's my contact information will be on the last slide. So if we don't get to you or you have a follow-up question, please do not hesitate to contact me. We are here for you. So we'll go ahead and get started. A couple of objectives. I'm of course not going to read these word for word, but we're going to talk about stress and try to define stressors in our lives. Think about how we respond to that stress. We're going to talk about stress and its implications for health, and we're going to focus specifically on mental health. And then we're going to talk about how we, as either supporters of farmers or whether that be personal or professional, can support ourselves and or farmers and really anybody in managing their stress. And that includes like identifying the signs and symptoms of mental health disorders, and then offering positive coping mechanisms and assisting our friends and families when they may need help. So we know agriculture is hazardous. Agriculture ranks among the most hazardous occupational industries in the United States. For dramatic effect, I typically tell people they're 8 times more likely to die in agriculture than any other occupation. And that even includes our classically hazardous occupations like construction and mining. The agricultural hazards are diverse. We, of course, have large machinery, we have confined spaces, we have livestock, we have tractors. Tractors are the leading cause of fatality in agriculture. But we're certainly starting to recognize that agriculture is mentally hazardous. And we talk about mental hazards, we talk a lot about stress. Agriculture has certainly been identified as one of the most stressful occupations. We're going to talk about what some of those specific stressors are in agriculture here in a minute. But I like to start typically by sort of expanding our vocabulary and probably making our vocabulary more precise in the way we talk about stress and the stress experience. To typically start by asking people to think about what some of their stressors of their lives are. And stressors are really defined as something that cause a state of strain or tension. So it's really something that we can identify and say, this causes me either strain or tension in my life. And I think when we think about classic stressors in the US population, we think a lot about our jobs. I think our jobs introduce stress for a number of different people. Of course, I have a picture of like a crying baby there, but thinking about how our family might create some stress for us. A stress I often hear at my age is people are moving, they're buying and selling homes, and while that can be very exciting, it certainly creates a number of obstacles to try to deal with. And another one we hear among our aging population is chronic illness and managing illness or injury. And so we think about stressors, they can be really diverse, and they really are. And I think it's important to recognize they may be very short term, like buying a home. Buying a home may introduce stressors, but they may be very short lasting. Whereas managing a chronic illness may be much more persistent stress or long-term stress. I think it's also important to acknowledge that though we may say our families cause us stress, we certainly love and adore our families. Similarly, our jobs may provide us some stress, but there's certainly something that also can be very rewarding. And so I think it's kind of important to acknowledge that stressors are both good and bad. And it's really how we decide to manage those stressors that is really predictive of how we're going to be able to function fully. And so stress then is the state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances, i.e. those stressors. So these are oftentimes a little less hard to put our finger on. It's pretty easy to say the weather is causing me some stress. We've identified the stressor, that's the weather, but the way we respond to it is a little bit more difficult to really describe. But this is really how you personally respond to stress. And some really common stress conditions include things like being very irritable, experiencing physical symptoms of sickness, and that might be a nervous stomach, just kind of classic intermittent nausea. But for some people, it's something as serious as a stomach ulcer. We may start to feel symptoms of anxiety, whether that's restlessness, maybe unable to sleep, sleeping too much, feeling like our heart is racing. Our body's response to the stressors is really our stress response. I think it's really important to acknowledge that everybody responds to stress differently, and everyone's threshold for stress is a little bit different. And it probably is not surprising to you if I told you that stress is actually very good for us. But there's a caveat there, and stress is good to us to a point. And this is the stress performance curve, and you can see it's a bit of a bell-shaped curve, and there are three sort of pictures above that. And I use a good example of imagine studying for finals, or finals week is approaching. If you were like some students on campus, the first 15 weeks of the semester, there's been very little stress. And you may be finding yourself a little bit inactive, you may even be a little bit bored. But as the finals week approaches, you start to realize, maybe you have a rude awakening that you kind of need to get your rear in gear and start studying. And that's where we start to build, we become a little bit more motivated. I think we all would become a little bit more focused. We may decide to spend a little more time with the books, a little bit less time with Netflix perhaps. And then really it's that week before and that week of finals week that we are at our peak performance. So we've been motivated, we've encouraged ourselves. We are maybe at our most productive right now. We might feel like we're firing on all cylinders. And thankfully, finals week is about 1 week. And if you are a fortunate college student, you get to go home after that finals week and maybe spend the next several days or weeks relaxing. And we re-enter that period of inactivity and maybe even boredom. What we see, however, is if we don't experience some sort of reprieve from that stress, and we're expected to maintain sort of a peak performance for a long period of time, that stress level remains high, we start to get very fatigued and we become less productive and we reach points of exhaustion, and those stress responses that we talked about before become very evident, and they may manifest as anxiety and anger and panic. We may get physically sick. We notice people who experience chronic stress, their immune systems are often depleted and they get physically sick. And at some point, you're going to reach a point where you burn out and you break down. And that's really the difference then between acute stress and chronic stress. And acute stress is very much that short-term stress. Stressors may not necessarily be minor, but they're quickly resolving. And I think finals week is a really good example of that. Selling a home or buying a home is a good example of that. Chronic stress, however, is when we experience periods of long-term stress. And the stressors are really relentless. And when we talk about agriculture in the last couple of years, we're talking about chronic stress. Because if I go back, our farmers aren't getting an opportunity to then find that inactive or bored phase. They're typically asked to perform at that peak performance stage for as long as possible. We talk a lot about some of the stressors in agriculture, and it seems as though we made a joke this year that we're just sort of playing whack-a-mole with stressors, and every time the weather starts to cooperate, it's the markets, and every time the markets maybe look like they're turning around, it's something else. And so when we talk about farming especially, we talk much more about chronic stress. And chronic stress is really what's hazardous to our health. And so stress has been associated with a number of different health outcomes. Some of our more classic physical health outcomes include things like heart disease. So there's been an association between chronic stress and the development of heart disease. Obesity, and that's both a function of maybe not taking the time to eat right and exercise, but actually our body's composition changing and our cells changing and sort of maintaining or building on our BMI perhaps. Diabetes has been associated with stress, which we know is a serious chronic health condition. Manageable, but certainly something we want to be keeping in mind. And I think it's really easy to get people's attention with some of these more serious chronic physical health conditions, but probably more common are some of the mental health conditions. And these include things like depression and anxiety. And those are certainly associated with stress, and we saw that on the stress scale. Those may present earlier than some of these physical health conditions that may take years to manifest. So we're going to focus today especially on anxiety and depression. And I'm going to share the results of a survey we did of young farmers and ranchers in central, I should say the upper Midwest. We sometimes like to believe that farmers and ranchers are invincible. They're obviously very smart individuals, very productive, hard workers, and we often think they may be immune to some of the mental health conditions that plague the rest of the population. However, we did a survey of, like I said, young farmers and ranchers in 4 upper Midwestern states, and we screened them for anxiety and depression using screening instruments that you might find in clinical care. So we were not diagnosing, but we were just screening. And what we found is that of our respondents, 70% screened positive for at least mild symptoms of anxiety. And similarly, almost 60% screened positive for at least mild symptoms of depression. And we had a psychiatrist on this project as an advisor and sort of someone to help us interpret the results. And he had not grown up in agriculture. He was from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And he looked at me when we had these results and just straight out asked, what is farming? Like, why are we seeing these high rates of anxiety and depression in this population? As a reference, we typically observe somewhere around 20% of the population, of the US population, would meet the criteria for anxiety, and about 8 or 9% would meet the criteria for depression. So we observed prevalence much higher than what we see in the general population. And when we looked at the association between stress and mental health, we certainly found an association between financial stress. I think finances are one of the most commonly cited sources of stress among farmers and non-farmers, right? Personal finances certainly weigh on, I think, everyone's mind. So we were not at all excited or surprised to find that. We also found general economic conditions were associated with both anxiety and depression. So people who reported more worry about general, larger, sort of global economics screen positive for anxiety and depression. Again, not that surprising. However, we also found that people who reported time pressures, so not having enough time to get all their tasks done, were more likely to report or screen positive for anxiety and depression. And also stress that results from interpersonal relationships in the ag environment. So we think especially about family farms, the family dynamic there, farms who hire employees. People who reported more interpersonal stress reported more anxiety and depression. And I like to point this out because the last few years, farm stress and mental health has gotten a lot of attention, and we would say it's because of the farm economy, the financial farm economy. But I think it's really important to realize that some of these issues are not going to go away, even if prices rebound, and it's a conversation we need to be having all of the time. This is a quote from an ag business person in central Wisconsin. We were sort of talking about, I had done interviews of agribusiness personnel at a large outdoor farm show, and I kind of asked, what are you seeing among your clients? How would you describe their mental health? And there was a lot of conversations around a lot of stress. Obviously, one person mentioned suicide. Others used terms like anxiety and depression to describe their client population. I asked, what's your role in all of this as friends and confidants? How would you describe your role in mental health promotion? And one person said, I think, summed it up perfectly. I think this is what all of us have been thinking, is that these are our friends, they're people we know personally and professionally. They might be our family members, and we certainly want to help. This gentleman said, I want to help. I think we all do. I really just don't know how. And I think that's really paralyzed a lot of people in the agricultural industry, feeling like we don't have the skills or expertise to start addressing some of these mental health concerns we have for our friends and family members, thinking that just because we aren't licensed mental health providers that we have no business being there. And so one thing I like to encourage is that I tell people, if you care, you have a role in this if you want one. And that's what we're really going to talk about next, is how you can help yourself. All of what we're going to talk about today are things you can directly apply to yourself, or how you can help others. And so we're going to talk through really identifying the signs and symptoms of chronic stress, often described as becoming anxious or depressed, how we promote and what types of coping strategies we do promote, and self-care strategies. There are a lot of ways to cope with stress, and some of them are certainly more healthy than others. And then how we offer encouragement and start conversations, which is oftentimes the most challenging piece of all of this, but we're going to talk through some helpful conversation starters. And then finally, if you recognize somebody needs professional help, or if you think you yourself need professional help, where should you go first, and where might you be able to find that? Because it's certainly not always easy. The first thing we're going to talk about are the signs and symptoms. And so we talk a little bit about anxiety and depression manifesting physically, which seems like it's not something that would impede our physical health necessarily, but it certainly can. We notice people describe feeling very achy, aches and pains that just sort of come out of nowhere and seem to be without cause. We talked a little bit already about stomach ulcers and just having a general nauseous feeling, which may come or go, or may be very persistent. Dizziness is actually one of the most classic physical symptoms of anxiety and depression, and I'm working on a study right now, and we're seeing a lot of dizziness in farm youth, as they describe it on some large public health surveys, and they've included that statement because they know dizziness is a way of describing and sort of screening for mental health disorders. Headaches, chest pains, of course. When we talk about feeling extreme symptoms of anxiety, people often describe chest pains. It feels like they're having a heart attack. A lot of people present to emergency rooms under the impression they are having a heart attack, and it's actually an anxiety attack. And then we also talked a little bit about your immune system being completely depleted after experiencing periods of chronic stress. And so thinking about if you're continuously getting a cold, if you just can't shake any illness that sets in, that could certainly be a sign and a symptom. These are more difficult to recognize in somebody else. These truly are symptoms, meaning they're only experienced by the individual who is physically feeling them. So unless somebody were to complain of constant stomach aches or complain of aches and pains or a chronic cold, it would be very difficult for us as an outsider to be able to identify those. However, there are changes in behavior that we as outsiders may be able to pick up on, and we may be able to pick up on more than the person who's actually experiencing the distress. Some behavioral changes you might want to watch out for are people who eat too much or way too little. I use the example of my father. My father farms in central Iowa. Every spring and fall, he experiences enough stress that he typically loses, he just kind of stops eating, and he typically loses anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds, and he's a pretty thin man as it is. I kind of joke, we always know when he's starting to feel better, or maybe harvest is coming to a close, because he'll go to Denny's, which is near our hometown, and have a double cheeseburger with fries and a side of pancakes, which is just kind of a bizarre combination anyway, but he'll eat it all. And just to see him sort of like regain that appetite is kind of a huge relief to us as a family. Similarly, sleeping way too much or way too little. I grew up in an old farmhouse, and I could hear my father, again in the spring and the fall, sort of creaking around the house, knowing he probably wasn't sleeping. A lot of sleepless nights. I think farmers especially can relate to that. One that's a little bit more difficult to talk about is the usage of drugs or alcohol. And not that it's super hard to talk about, but it's confusing in the Midwest and in rural America, because I use the example, if you have had a really wonderful day at work, let's say maybe you got promoted, you finished a huge project, we typically like to celebrate with happy hour. I remember a number of occasions, my friends sort of knocking on the office door and saying, hey, I had a great day, let's do a happy hour. And as your friend, you're like, yeah, of course, let's go. But I think we also certainly sort of use alcohol as a coping mechanism. And so if you've had a terrible day, you've had a really, really crummy day, you may want nothing more than just like a cold beer. And it gets a little confusing when we use alcohol to celebrate and to sort of commiserate. And it becomes a little bit confusing and makes it more difficult to talk about because it is so pervasive in the way we live our lives. Procrastinating or neglecting tasks. We see this a lot in people who start to ignore basic hygiene. We see it in livestock. If people start to neglect their livestock, neglect their farm or their homestead, that might be a red flag and is something you should ask about. Nervous habits. These, everyone probably has a nervous habit. I have a good friend and he bites his nails. He doesn't even realize he bites his nails anymore. And I've picked up on it. It's his nervous habit. So if I find him biting his nails, I'm kind of quick to ask, is there something on your mind? And he might say, no, why? And I say, well, you're biting your nails. And it's an opportunity for him to stop and think and realize, I know this is one of his nervous habits. And then he says, well, I guess I've kind of been stressed about this, or I'm thinking about this. And we talk about it, and talking about it is obviously very important. Other changes in behavior may be lack of concentration or forgetfulness. I have a good example of emotional changes. there's a list here, obviously, irritability or short-tempered. Similarly, when I was growing up on a farm, if you needed something from a parent in the spring or the fall, you should probably just go to mom. Dad was always a little irritable in the spring or the fall, quite easily agitated. Again, stress was at an all-time high. We've since sort of woke up to the situation, and we'll kind of call him on that when it's appropriate. Emotional changes include senses of loneliness, feeling very overwhelmed. I had, or just sort of constant worry. I had a farm wife come to me, and she said, I didn't know anything was up with my husband until he started really questioning his marketing decisions. She said, he is a brilliant marketer. People in the community kind of call on him for advice in marketing, ask what he's doing. He used to have so much confidence around marketing his grain. And he started to question every decision he made. He asked me if I thought he was making the right decision. And he would just sort of sit at the kitchen counter with just sort of no idea what to do next. She goes, and that's when I realized something had really changed. Another important one to keep an eye on is isolation. And this is hard, especially in agriculture, because there's always something to do. And people can make every excuse in the world to isolate themselves. There's always a chore, there's always a task, something needs fixed or moved or cleaned or repaired. But thinking about people who used to always be in church or maybe always be at the high school basketball game and they're not showing up, it certainly would warrant swinging by, maybe sending them a text, hey, we missed you at church. Are you going to be there next week? And it's an opportunity then to start a conversation. If someone says, no, I'm not going to make it, you may say, well, I haven't seen you in a while. Do you mind if I swing by after dinner? It's very easy. We're already isolated because we're in typically rural areas. We work really interesting hours oftentimes. The classic social interactions don't really lend themselves to our lifestyle. And so thinking about how we can keep people socially connected, we'll talk about how important that is. Even in times of, again, peak season, being very busy, but keeping an eye out for people, especially if we're concerned about them. I think when we talk about agitation and irritability, just to go back to those for a second, if you grew up in a rural area or a farm community, you might be able to identify somebody who was just seemed like they were always mad. And as a result, they'd really isolated themselves. They maybe lived on the fringes of society. And while we might say that was just a grumpy old man, the reality is that he or she could have been suffering from and experiencing anxiety or depression for years. And what we know about mental health help is that people typically wait upwards, on average, I should say, 11 years to get mental health help. Who is to say how long some people have been living in a very irritable or agitated state, not because they choose to be, but because of their mental health condition. We talk about promoting self-help strategies and positive coping. These are really ways that we want to deal with stress that are healthy. They have huge impacts on both our mental health and our physical health. I sort of joke, I don't joke, I'm a stress eater. So the pizza place knows my name and they kind of know to show up with like a concerned smile when they deliver my pizza. They're like, hey, this is an awfully large pizza for just you. What's going on? Thankfully, I also do kind of stress work out. I find that if I've had an extremely stressful day, it's nice to just sort of clear my head with a run. So I try to justify it by saying it balances itself out. But I think we can all probably imagine coping strategies that are not as healthy, right? So we're going to talk through 5 today, and I created this acronym called HERDS. I didn't create the coping strategies. Those are evidence-based and sort of general recommendations. I just rearranged the order so they're easy to remember for agriculture. I thought HERDS was appropriate. And they are hobbies, exercise, relaxation, diversion, and social connectedness. And I know you're going to say like, yeah, duh, Josie. And sometimes I find myself saying, yeah, duh, these are obviously good for you. But I think it takes some pause for all of us to think about the major barriers there are to actually implementing some of these. And so when we talk about hobbies and exercise and relaxation and diversion and social connectedness to farmers, there are a lot of challenges to that. And we've created a list. I've worked with farmers the last couple of years to start a list of what might be manageable coping strategies for each of the different categories. And I make a joke that hobbies, there's really only 2 criteria for a hobby. And the first one is that it cannot be your job. So farming can't be a hobby. And it also has to be very expensive. And that's the joke. And I think when we do look at hobbies, some people have decided that like vacationing in Europe is their hobby. For most of us, that's not attainable. But I do think the farm environment and the rural environment lends itself to some hobbies by nature, literally nature, like gardening. But a lot of people I've talked to do woodworking in their shop because they already have a lot of those tools. They do different types of welding projects. They restore equipment. We see a lot of people restoring old farm equipment. They volunteer for their churches. My parents got really into gardening recently. And because my father does have a bit of an anxious personality, he typically doubles the amount he plants towards the end of probably early June, because he has a moment where he's just convinced that everything's going to die, so we better plant twice as much. When we have twice as many tomatoes, that lends itself to hobbies like canning and making salsa and tomato sauce and giving that out as gifts when necessary. So they say hobbies lead to more hobbies, and I certainly think that's true. Exercise is hard, mostly because it's just can be completely miserable. But when we talk about exercise in the farm environment, we certainly don't expect people to do CrossFit. One older gentleman asked me one time, "So you think I'm just gonna like do Zumba?" I said, if that's something you're interested in, then absolutely. But if not, there are different activities. One person said that they had poured a concrete slab and their kids convinced them to put a basketball hoop in it, even though they really didn't want to. But of course the kids won. And now they have like this random sort of rec league basketball that happens in their Morton building every couple of times a month, and kids and adults alike get together to play basketball. A couple of people mentioned their community still offers swing dancing, which is both a hobby and exercise and social connectedness. One thing we started doing on our farm, which is very, very novel, was we started walking our beans again. Not all of them, but with the onset of a four-wheeler and then eventually a gator, it had been a really long time since anybody had truly walked beans. But we know 20 minutes, when we talk about exercise, we're just asking for about 20 minutes a few times a week to get your heart rate out of its resting heart rate pace. And it has tremendous impacts on both your physical and mental health. I'm going to talk briefly about relaxation and diversion, mostly because we need to relax more. We find our young farmers are getting especially burnt out. They're feeling disconnected from their spouses. And a good way to get away and relax is obviously a vacation, and that's not possible for everybody. But when it is possible, I think we as an industry in general need to be very supportive of that. I know some people have told me when they told their neighbor they were going to go on vacation, their neighbor made some snide comment like, "Oh, I wish I could afford that. Oh, I suppose you want me to do your chores for you." And what we should be saying is, that's great. You know, show me the photos when you get home. I'll do your chores, and maybe, you know, next summer you could do mine. I think we really need to be more encouraging of people taking time for themselves and getting away, or else we're going to work ourselves out of farmers. It's just not sustainable to be working all day, every day. Social connectedness, we talked a little bit about how easy it is to become very isolated, but the reality is that social connectedness is probably, of all of these things, the most important. So humans need humans. We've seen that despite being connected with our cell phones to everybody and everything, we are the most lonely as a population that we've ever been. So thinking about ways to be socially connected, whether it's sports or church or interest groups, I would say, Extension does a really nice job of hosting educational events, and they build time into that for people to have lunch together or break time to have coffee together. And if you run an organization, think about ways you can encourage social connectedness beyond just the educational offerings that you have. I told you we were going to talk about how we offer encouragement and start what we might say are difficult conversations. I have a list of conversation starters, and I have the goods and the bads. So we typically play this sort of as a game, but as a webinar, it might be a little bit difficult. So I just sort of categorize them for us. But we're going to start with maybe what not to say. And it's really easy when we see a friend or a loved one maybe experiencing symptoms of depression. It's really easy to say, you could snap out of this if you wanted to. This is all in your head. Or we like to remind people that maybe they don't have it that bad. So what do you have to be sad about? Other people have it a lot worse than you do. And time and time again, research has found that these statements are not helpful at all. They often inflict a tremendous amount of guilt on whomever you've said it to. They probably know that there are maybe people out there who do have it worse off than them. But in this moment, the way they're feeling right now, they don't have that sort of perspective. And so it's really, really not helpful to try to tell somebody that, despite this bad day, their life is really just daisies. Another comment on this list is the question, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? And it's phrased, we often want to say it like that, but what we would call this a leading question. And I use a similar example is if I were to say, I don't look fat in this, do I? There's really no option for anyone to say anything but, no, of course not, right? I led the question. I had the answer that I wanted to hear in the question. And it's no different than this question, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? You're not giving somebody much option to say anything but, no, of course not. We will talk about how important it is to talk about suicide and how we might describe that on the next, or in the green category. Again, telling somebody they could snap out of this or it's all in their head. Again, really not helpful, not productive ways to start a conversation. And one thing you do is it sends a message that you have no idea what they're going through, and that you're not that interested in it. And you've really cut off any really opportunity for future conversation that you may be able to have with somebody. So those are just ones I would not go towards. In the green category, in the options you would say are great ways to start a conversation, is offering to help somebody. So sometimes when people are feeling completely overwhelmed or experiencing tremendous distress, the most basic tasks may seem like such an inconvenience. So offering to help with something. Is there anything I can help you with? They may need a ride to town. They may need help changing a tire, whatever it might be. But sending that message that I am here to help you, as big or as small as that might be, is really, really powerful. Have you considered suicide or self-harm? You can see how this is phrased differently than the question about suicide in the red column. People get very nervous to ask about suicide because there's this thought that if I even say the word suicide, I'm going to put the idea in their heads. And every mental health organization would say that is the biggest myth, one of the biggest myths about suicide prevention. And everybody would encourage, if you are concerned about suicide, every organization, and I would too, would encourage you to ask the question, have you considered suicide or self-harm? And it's, like I said, it's a tough question to ask. I've practiced saying it I practice having conversations like this while I'm driving. I practice saying it in the mirror. I took a mental health first aid class, which we'll talk about here in a second. And we had to practice saying, have you considered suicide or self-harm? And not a super proud moment, but I had gotten pulled over when for speeding my lights weren't on my way home from that. And the officer asked me where I had been, and I said I was at this mental health first aid training, and he said, well, what's that? And I just responded with, have you considered suicide or self-harm? And it was surprising to me how quickly it just came out of my mouth, that I was able to ask that. And he responded with, no, like, what's that have to do with this? I said, and then I explained what the class was about. But I know it's not easy, but if you are worried about somebody, you could save their life. So I would encourage you to practice saying it. I often say, have you considered self-harm or harm to someone else? Realizing that if somebody is under tremendous stress, they may become very easily agitated, and they may be in an environment where there is somebody else that they could inflict harm onto. And that might be a spouse or a child. And so making sure that we're thinking about those individuals as well. Simple statements like, I'm worried about you. Okay, that's a really easy way to start a conversation, because you're communicating that you're asking these questions out of love and care. So I often say you could start by saying, I'm worried about you, and I've noticed changes in your behavior or your mood, right? Highlighting where you've seen changes, so that an individual can reflect on their own behavior and say, yeah, you're right. I haven't been sleeping, or I have been drinking more, or I haven't been eating. But acknowledging that you are in tune with them enough to point out those behavior changes is really powerful. And it certainly validates your concern. I'm not just concerned about you because I know that it's a terrible ag economy. I'm worried about you because you seem much more agitated than you usually are. Or I'm worried about you because it looks like you're not sleeping like you should be. Or I'm worried about you because, your truck used to be the most pristine truck in the county, and you've just really let it go. And that's not like you. And then realizing that there's a lot of power in asking, is there someone you'd feel more comfortable talking to? Just because you have offered to help doesn't mean that individual wants to talk to you. A good example is when I was in Wisconsin, we had a lot of bankers begging for mental health information. They said, we want to be helpful. We want to be responsive to our farmers, and we certainly applauded them for that. But when we asked farmers, who do you want to talk to about your mental health? Bankers, probably not surprising, were not at the top of our list. And so we kind of had to tell bankers, like, listen, we recognize your heart's in the right place. Farmers don't really want to have these conversations with you. What you would be better off asking is there someone you feel comfortable talking to about this? And then connecting them to that person. And in small communities, there may be pastors, there may be mentors or very close friends or family members that you could connect that individual to if they said there was somebody they feel more comfortable talking to. So again, I think it's really important, whatever you do, you express compassion and care for that person. And that really helps to open the door for a conversation that could be challenging, a conversation that could last a while. And that's one thing somebody said. He said, I made a sales call and I ended up being there 2.5 hours. But I canceled the rest of my afternoon because this guy was finally willing to talk, and I wanted to be there for him. And that's another thing we find, is that a lot of people, there's so much help in just talking, letting people express what they're going through, getting it out into the open. When we have to hold our feelings and our emotions in, we feel like we're living this alone. It becomes a huge burden. And so oftentimes just being able to talk and get those feelings out, there's a tremendous amount of healing and therapy in that, obviously. Finally, when we talk about professional help, these are sort of what I recommend. I think the first line of defense should be your primary care physician. I say that because we know mental health providers are not always available in rural areas, but your primary care physician would be able to screen and diagnose for any sort of mental health condition. They could also medicate if they think that's an option and it's something that an individual is interested in. I know there's a lot of sort of stigma around medication, but I would encourage people to remember that we take medications for a lot of different conditions, and a mental health condition is really no different. And most importantly, your primary care physician will help you navigate the mental health services that are available to you, both locally and within your insurance network. We know that is a huge barrier to getting mental health care. I'm going to jump down to the mental health provider. If those are available, psychologists and psychiatrists are a great place and a resource. However, when we talk about barriers to mental health care, we often describe it as the 4 A's, and that is affordability. So a lot of mental health care providers are not within the grasp of most insurances. We talk about availability and accessibility, and so they're not in our communities. They're not available when we need them to be. They're oftentimes a long wait period, and in some cases our feelings of distress may be resolved by then. And then the 4th A is really acceptability. And so there still remains, especially in rural areas, a stigma around getting mental health care. And I think that's probably the biggest limitation, because even if services were available in locally and affordable, if somebody felt like it wouldn't be acceptable for them to go to that provider, they might not. And so I think of all of the things we in Extension can do, or we as sort of not CEOs of hospitals can do, it's encourage the acceptability of caring for our mental health, encouraging others to care for their mental health like we would care for our physical health. I have a couple of hotlines on here. I really like the Iowa Concern hotline, not just because I'm from Iowa, but because it's a rural hotline, and you can call that hotline with frustrations, whether they be legal, financial, stress-related, or crisis or disaster mediation. And so it's manned by a number of different individuals with different expertise. So you could get some legal, like I said, legal or financial help, in addition to stress management or crisis counseling if you need it. Finally, the last one we'll talk about is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I would encourage you to have this in your phone or kind of screenshot of it. They have an online chat option. You call this number, and I believe it refers you to your state National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Excitingly, we have a 3-digit suicide prevention lifeline that will be rolled out hopefully shortly, very similar to 911. They've decided that a physical health crisis obviously warrants a 3-digit crisis line, and a mental health crisis should warrant and does warrant a 3-digit crisis line. So I believe that's going to be 988, and it'll be a national line. And we're very excited that that's finally going to be a thing. So we don't have to try to remember these, 12-digit numbers in an emergency. And then finally, so maybe professional health isn't an option for somebody. Maybe they're really resistant to that. Again, asking if there's someone else they feel comfortable talking to. We surveyed farmers in central Wisconsin, and they said the people they are most willing to talk to include their spouses, their closest friends, and then some medical providers. And so we recognize that the closest circle, the spouses, the family members, and the friends are probably going to be our best line of defense. And it's certainly why we're trying to get this information out and trying to make sure that our friends and our family members feel comfortable having these conversations with individuals. So with that, I have 2 of those slides just to reiterate the importance of these resources and making sure you know where to find them. My contact information, like I said, if you have questions later if you have questions tomorrow or in a year, do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email address there, my office phone is there. You can obviously connect with me on Twitter. We're trying to do important and good work in farm stress management and mental health. We're excited that people are interested in this topic. We certainly are. We think it's very important. So with that, I'm going to move it to the evaluation slide because I think Zach told me to. And I would be happy to take any questions at this point.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rodolfi. Really appreciate it. So I don't have any streaming into the Q&A box yet, but there was a couple in the chat box that I'll ask. Someone asked a question when you were discussing the self-reported surveys about depression and anxiety, how accurate those surveys are. If you can speak to that at all.
How accurate? I mean, I think I should say they were, it was an online survey. We got our list from from Farm Bureau, Young Farmer and Rancher groups in 4 states. And so we're pretty confident that we captured farmers, and it was anonymous. And so we asked people to report symptoms of anxiety and depression using this validated instrument. And so we're pretty confident in the accuracy of those. We didn't ask, the way the questions are, it doesn't say like, do you have anxiety? Because then you'd obviously say no. But it asks a number of questions, and it asks how often in the past 2 weeks have you experienced 7 different symptoms of anxiety without using the term anxiety, and similarly 9 symptoms of depression. So we know we have a lot of confidence in the instrument, and we do feel like our results are accurate. We have a couple of projects going on now to try to validate what we found and expand that to include states like Illinois, obviously. And I think it's a good question because we present this at conferences, and we were sort of a young research team. And so a lot of people had the same sort of reaction, like, well, is that right? And that's what really led to some of the interviews we did. We said, well, let's corroborate what we heard, or try to, by asking industry representatives what they're seeing. And they really sort of helped validate what we had seen qualitatively by saying, my guys are stressed out, right? There's a lot going on out there. And so that sort of helped, I think, again, validate what we had seen.
Okay. So a couple more here, kind of comment / question, maybe you can comment. I think you covered it a little bit, but one of the attendees referenced that, even though it's been proven that exercise may be as effective as certain antidepressants, it's the lack of energy and of motivation that interferes with that strategy. So I think you kind of hit on that a little bit. I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that at all.
That is an excellent point, right? Because if you are experiencing depression, the very last thing you feel like doing is putting on your gym clothes and getting into a workout. I think we can all relate to that to some extent. I mean, like I said, exercise is miserable already. Have you been on a treadmill? Those things are awful. And that's where I say it's really important. There are days when I do not feel like working out. I know my body and my brain needs it. And I can typically call a friend and kind of express how I'm feeling. And she'll say, like, call me after the gym. If you do me a favor, go to the gym for half an hour. You don't have to force yourself to do much. You could go on a walk. A walk is as valuable as, like a 40-minute workout class. It's about getting your heart rate up a little bit. Walks are very therapeutic. Walks can be incredibly beneficial to our physical and mental health. So with that, another good example is, so it can be very low maintenance. Try to get out and take a walk, listen to some music, listen to a book. I could recommend a number of podcasts to keep people distracted. Another thing, accountability is in small groups. So I think there's a lot of power, and sometimes I don't want to work out. I do have like the luxury of a gym, which I know rural areas don't always have. And there's a number of people that expect to see me at spin class. And I'd rather go than try to explain to them why I'm not there sometimes, honestly. So thinking about who you could have hold accountable with you as some of your endeavors there have been times, I think like we all do, I've certainly experienced days where I'm much more feeling more depressed than others, and even weeks. And trying to convince yourself to get up and go to the gym is really hard. But I can usually tell myself, you're going to feel a lot better in 20 minutes. And again, try to find someone who you can have accountability with. Take a dog for a walk. I think that's really important.
Great. So a couple more questions just popped up. One is kind of a comment and a question, saying that it takes time to recover from burnout and chronic stress. Is there any data on this recovery time, et cetera?
Yes, good question. So when we query individuals for or screen them for anxiety or depression, we typically ask for them to describe their experience in the past 2 weeks, because we do know some of this is very transient. And like you said, it takes time to recover from burnout and chronic stress. And we typically believe that to be about 2 weeks. And so if, let's say, you had a really stressful period and you're kind of in that what quote unquote relaxation mode, but you find that you're still feeling a number or behaving in a number of different ways, like we talked about on those signs and symptoms pages, for more than 2 weeks, that's when I would say it's time to consider clinical care or expertise beyond what we have, or trying to purposefully implement some of those HERDS skills. Because you're right, it does take time. You're not just going to wake up right after final exams and be like ready to go necessarily, for sure.
Okay, so the final question we have in our Q&A box is, I exhibit every single symptom of anxiety and depression. I'm really not sure what to do next. So can you elaborate on folks who are in a situation like that, what your recommendations are?
Absolutely. And the first thing I would say is, like, if you can recognize that in yourself, that's already incredibly powerful, because then it gives you the opportunity to do something next and make a cognizant sort of effort towards that. For some people, it's not that easy. So I would say already, having that introspectiveness to recognize that is so valuable. And so from here, I think we have a couple of different options. Again, if primary care, and again, if the symptoms have persisted for 2 weeks, because that's the first question if you go into a clinical care or primary care setting, is they're going to ask you questions based on the last 2 weeks. So at 2 weeks, we've decided that this is probably clinically significant. So I would say if you have the option to go into your primary care provider, like I said, they're going to help you navigate the resources that are most available to you. There's also what I call a pretty good website, and it's called Farm State of Mind. And it was created by Bayer, and they have compiled a number of different resources. I think it's by state, all of the resources that are in each state, in the Midwest at least. And they include links to webinars, like I said, podcasts, some different types of literature. I think if you don't have primary care or mental health care providers at your fingertips, but you are in a place where you're still able to make proactive decisions, there are a number of really great books and podcasts out there. And then again, if you've tried sort of HERDS and it's not working for you, I would say those are other options. I would definitely encourage maybe trying to incorporate one of the HERDS letters into your daily life. And I hope you just know, like, you are not alone in this. And anytime you may feel like you're very alone, I want you to know that there are so many people going through probably similar situations. And there are people, more importantly, there are people there for you. And so, like I said, my email is always available. I'm happy to help guide people to resources. But I would say Farm State of Mind, is a website that is filled with resources. And some are specific for men, some are specific for women. And I do think that's a pretty good place for free resources.
Excellent. If you could share that link with me, I can get that out to everyone. I was having a hard time finding that website when farm state of mind just as a Google search. So we'll definitely make sure to get that link in the follow-up email.
I can do that.
Oh, and it looks like someone maybe shared a link to it. So if that's not it, thank you for that. If that's not it, we'll get that out in the follow-up email. So I'd really like to thank Dr. Rodolfi for sharing her expertise, insights, and research on this very important and difficult to talk about topic. I'd really like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope that you got something out of this that you can move forward with on your farm and your family and community. Please look for an email from us for the archive webinar and a short evaluation, as well as you can go ahead and scan the QR code on your screen right now to do the evaluation in real time. We do look forward to your feedback to shape future webinars. And with that, I'm going to wish you the rest of your fabulous day and a productive 2020 growing season.
Thank you so much.